So if we weren't in COVID lockdown 2019, we would be celebrating Easter and celebrating it in many ways. In South Africa, we have holidays, school holidays, all the schools, and long weekends forever. So everyone goes out and celebrates and have parties and plans all this. And I'm wondering in my reflections as where this started, if we do not forget the purpose of Easter. And for us to understand the purpose of Easter, I need to focus a bit on Passover. Because Passover is the festival where Jesus gave his life, the ultimate lamb. It connects the story of what we believe as Christians. And so we will stop at that. But if you want the full details, you can check it out at Jews for Jesus, or read the book of Exodus as a family tonight or tomorrow, or within this 2 weeks preparation of the celebration weekend, or watch the Bible Project video if you want to spend 7 to 8 minutes. The Bible Project video on Easter or on Exodus both tells the story. So the very short lowdown in a minute or two, which you can expect. He gets called by God to get that, to save the people. And God's words are the first important words in this story. Not that the rest isn't important. Yes, it's very good. Is that God says to Moses that I have heard the cries of my people. God heard the cries of my people. Secondly, I have chosen to act. I have chosen to act. So Moses goes back, and there's a fight over 10 plagues. There's one, the river running red yet again because of the water and poisoning the water of the Egyptians. The massacre and the mass murders. Secondly, praise goes on, the frogs and everything goes from there on. And the worst plague is the 10th plague. So the Pharaoh refuses 10 times. And the 10th plague is the death of all the firstborn sons in Egypt. And this is horrible. Terrifying to think that it takes such a measure to make the Egyptians realize the horridness that they are inflicting on other people is the death of their firstborns. But the story is not the same for the Jews. The Jews are going on. Their animals are safe. The plagues do not hit them. And here's why, especially the night before they are let free. And the 10th plague hit, and the Pharaoh's own son is dead, and therefore he is forced to let them go because he has no more defenses. The Jews are told by God to sacrifice a lamb, innocent lambs with 0 scars and breakage. And in this time, they sacrifice these lambs and they submit themselves unto God. And they paint the blood of this innocent lamb on their doorsills, op hulle deurwagte, poorte van hulle ingange. And as the angel of death goes through Egypt, he passes over the houses submitted to God. Pass over. He lets them live. He passes death over them. So the first thing is God hears us. The second thing, God acts upon it. And the third thing is that God passes us over. God gives us grace. And then they are freed. And the story of the Jews goes on, and their conversation with God, and their beautiful, crazy, sometimes ridiculously shocking relationship, as they do not necessarily hold to this faith in God and keep their faith and keep their promises and their submission under God. But this is Passover. Every year they remember this because this was a great freedom. This was a savor and grace from their survival. And God passed over from death. Death did not touch them. So in this time they are taught to celebrate Passover yearly, to teach the children these 4 things. Firstly, that God hears us, that God chooses to act on our behalf, that God calls us, and that God prevails us, and lastly, and also mostly important, that God passes us over. And this becomes a promise that God himself will come and rescue us from our sins, not just from mortal vein. Enter Jesus a couple of thousand odd years later, depending on which historian you want to follow. Jesus becomes human. He preaches a radical doctrine of love, a radical freedom of faith, a radical God that frees us from our sins, to live peacefully, to live within our means, to celebrate what we have. And on Passover, tensions are so great with the Roman threats and Roman suffering that's also bad on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Jewish leaders who had an expectation of what God coming to earth had to look like, and God's promise to come to rescue us to look like. And Jesus gets sacrificed on a Friday, and he spends 3 days in the grave. And on Easter Monday, we celebrate the prevalence. But here's the purpose of celebrating this story, telling the story of Jesus' crucifixion and Jesus' raising from the dead, Jesus' victory over the grave. It is to teach our children that God prevails, that God heard our cries to free us, that God acts upon it, and also in this time God will act upon it, that God will bring us freedom, give us grace, and that God will come again. May you in this time of Easter celebrate Easter with great joy. Even celebrate Passover as a great new way to just practice a bit different view on our Easter and celebrate the purpose. Maybe teach our children and our loved ones, tell them the story so that we can all learn. May you remember in this time that God prevails, and we will get out of COVID and out of the economic crisis, and we will celebrate God once more. Keep safe, keep home, have a blessed Easter.